Working just in mic. I think it's a little hot right now, so we'll bring it down. So if you're timing me, don't start yet. This is a preface. So this is really my sweet spot, and I say that because for over 30 years, I taught social studies to eighth graders in room 314 at Bateman School. And one of the wonderful things about today is that one of my former students has traveled up here from Chicago, and Michael Yamashiro, who was a very bright young man, was very passionate about history and equity and social justice. And beyond that, I have to let you know, I'm so excited because in August, he's going to be teaching eighth grade social studies in room 314 at Bateman School, the very same place where I used to taught him. And so, Michael, with that, I'm passing the proverbial torch to you. Just know you have to give that back at the end of the evening. So, I want to thank you so much for coming tonight as we take a look at big business, big shoulders. Chicago comes of age during the industrial era, and you probably realize where the inspiration came from the poem Chicago by Carl Sandburg. Hog butcher for the world, tool maker, stacker of wheat, player with railroads and the nation's freight handler, stormy, husky, brawling, city of the big shoulders. So what we want to take a look at is how in the world does Chicago go and its incorporation of 1837 to 4,000 people and end up being at one point the fourth largest city in the world. It truly was the city of the century for the 19th century, as the epicenter for urbanization, industrialization, and immigration. And it was literally growing to the point that some reasonable people expected it would eventually pass the population of New York City. So if you take a look at the increases in populations, it's absolutely stunning. In the first 23 years, it went up 25-fold. Then it quintuples over the next 20 years. Then it triples for the next 20 years. And after that, it more than doubles. So how did all that happen? Well, we'll take a look at that. So our main sections for tonight are muck, manufacturers, meat, merchants, mail order, and maintaining the legacies. So if you learn nothing else tonight, you will discover that Mr. Phelps really likes alliteration. So here we go. Section 1, which is muck, as in yuck. So water would prove to be both the boon and the bane of early Chicago. What do I mean by that? Well, the Erie Canal changes everything for people living in the United States. Before that, if you lived on the eastern seaboard, if it was New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Washington, wherever it was, you were separated from the Great Lakes in the interior by the Appalachian Mountains, which was a really difficult travel. With the advent of the Erie Canal, you could travel from any of these cities to New York and then travel on the canal, and you would get to the Great Lakes. Once you reach the Great Lakes, you could travel by boat. So for a business owner deciding whether or not to pick Chicago as a location, imagine this: an easy trip to Milwaukee. You could go to Detroit, you could go to Cleveland, you could go to Erie, to Buffalo, all by boat. But some people knew that there was something even better, and that is Chicago has access to this whole interior to the west. How would that be? Because the watershed for the Great Lakes and the watershed for the Mississippi River are less than 2 miles apart from this near the city of Chicago. So all you would have to do would be to build a canal, and all of a sudden you could travel from New York, you'd go to Chicago. And from Chicago, you could go to Minneapolis, you could go to Kansas City, you could go to St. Louis, you could go to Memphis, you could go to New Orleans, you could go to Cincinnati, you could go to Pittsburgh. And so that's exactly what they did. And in 1848, the Illinois and Michigan Canal opened. At the time, originally starting with the Chicago River. This is the Des Plaines River, by the way, right next door to us. And this would connect and allow goods to be transported all the way down to New Orleans. But something even better comes along. And that would be the railroads, running about 15 years behind the canals. They would follow the routes of the canal. And of course, that was a faster form of transportation. By 1861, you can see that Chicago is becoming the railroad epicenter of the nation. From Chicago, you could travel up and down the Mississippi. You could travel along the Great Lakes. and you could travel up and down the eastern seaboard. That's not necessarily by accident. Most of the first railroads were created by land grants approved either by states or by the federal government. So that meant the governments then decided what were the starting and ending points of each railroad line. So for railroads from the east, the government decided they would end in Chicago. And for railroads headed to the west, the government decided they would start from Chicago. So either way, you were going to end up in Chicago. So the effect of these advances in transportation are absolutely tremendous. In 1845, Chicago was described as a mud town by one of the Lake Forest founding fathers, at a grand total of 7,000 people. 3 years later, the canal is finished. And look, from 1845 to 1849, a span of only 4 years, you see that the city population more than triples. By 1850, the U.S. is up to almost 10,000 miles of railroad, and they're moving to the west. By an 11-year span from 1849 to 1860, saw Chicago's population more than quadruple. So the effect of Chicago being the transportation hub of the nation was absolutely tremendous. So here's the downside of water. This is kind of what the Chicago streets look like. In fact, there was a standing joke, which goes like this. A man passing down the street finds a gentleman buried up to his shoulders in the mud. The man asks, "Do you need help?" Gentleman replies, "No, thank you. I have a fine horse under me." So actually, horses got stuck in the mud all the time. So did wagons. And people literally would abandon their wagons. It just was too much trouble. So why was there so much mud? Well, it was a city of muck, as I said before, as in yuck. It was a mix of mud, water, and sewage. So first of all, Chicago, the location was a horrible place to establish a major city. It was on the shore of Lake Michigan, which meant that it was right on the water table of Lake Michigan. You could dig down maybe 3 shovelfuls and boom, you would hit water. On top of that, the land itself was already a swamp, so they're putting buildings on top of the swamp. There were no sewers back then. There were no toilets. No. There were outhouses which couldn't drain naturally into the ground underneath them. And there were people who would literally lean out the window and dump out their bedpans on whoever happened to be walking by. Did I mention there were horses everywhere? So you know what inevitably happened there. So the water and sewage did not drain anywhere. It literally sat on the streets. Inevitably, that would lead to cholera, typhoid fever, dysentery, and death. So in 1855, the city's leader came up with a plan. They couldn't build a sewer because it was all water underneath. So what they did is they decided instead they would raise the street 6 to 10 feet. Then they could put a sewer in between the new street level, what had been the old street levels. They added a crown to the street so the water would drain off to the side. And then in between the two levels again, they could build an underground sewer where the sewage would flow downhill, and the sewage would flow into the Chicago River and would flow into Lake Michigan. Some of you may realize why that's just a Band-Aid at best. Yeah, because that's where they got their drinking water. So here's another thing. So if you own a building and your street entrance is equal to the street, the same level, and they raise the street 6 feet, your building is now underground. So they had a solution for that. And this is where the hero comes in. George M. Pullman. We're not getting into the railroad cars yet. This is the first big thing he did. He was an engineer, and he came up with a process for lifting buildings between 4 and 14 feet, and he used jack screws. So if you remember high school physics, you learned about simple machines, and the screw is one of them. That's essentially what you're looking at. So here's a picture of Pullman and his army of workers lifting the Briggs House Hotel, a total of 4.5 feet. What they would do is they would dig under the flooring of the building, and they would have an army of men spread out all overneath. And you can see here in the drawing, they all have a jack screw, and they have an arm on the jack screw. Somebody will blow the whistle, and every 15 seconds, everybody gives it a quarter pull at the exact same time. So it would be lifted like this. It wouldn't be lifted like that. So one of the other buildings that he lifted was the Tremont Hotel. And it went so flawlessly that they served dinner and guests drank champagne during the whole thing. and had absolutely no idea that they came out after dinner and they said, "What happened? We can't step off the front step anymore." So that's just how truly seamless it was. And they could lift not just individual buildings, but this is described as a half city block. It's almost a full city block. And you can see what Pullman did here. This is where it started. Here as it went up. He lifted 35,000 tons of building. It was about 4 to 5 feet up in the air. So what if you didn't raise your building? So here is an owner who decided, back with that, I'm just keeping everything where it was. So we see now why Pullman was necessary. This building got raised, this building got raised, and people walking by on the sidewalk are now looking in the second story window of that particular house. So, excuse me. So getting back to the sewage system and the water. So this lovely photo is taken of an area known as Bubbly Creek. It's part of the South Branch of the Chicago River, and it flowed right by the stockyards. So that was one problem, because when they were finished cutting up the animals, they take all the leftover parts and they throw them into Bubbly Creek. Bubbly Creek did not bubble because it was some kind of natural spa, but because the animal parts were decomposing. It was like a methane swamp, if you will. On top of that, it may be that the sewage system worked too well because, as I said, it all ended up in the lake, which was where you got your drinking water. You would stand on a bridge in Chicago and you would smell the sewage. You could see a dead horse floating by, and routinely the water color was red, not anything to do with St. Patrick's Day, but it was the blood from all the animal. On top of that, the water filtration system for the early waterworks was really bad. You could literally turn on the tap and it was possible that a minnow could drop out into your glass of water. So in 1867, they come up with a new plan. And what they're going to do is they're going to have the water intake pushed 2 miles offshore. If you've been at the Navy Pier, if you've been on one of the boat tours, you've seen these concrete cribs out there in the lake. They still exist to this day. So we're going to go out 2 miles and we're going to draw the water from the bottom of the lake there, which is about 30 feet down. So this will be the water intake. This will be the pump, which will then send it out to the rest of the city. And all you need is an army of Irish immigrants to dig the tunnel underneath. Why the Irish? Well, they were given such fabulous job opportunities as police officer, firemen, or digging the tunnel, which could collapse at any second and kill them instantly. So they didn't have a lot of choices. So in either event, they got it accomplished. You may recognize these buildings. These were added 2 years later. So here's the water tower on Michigan Avenue. And then here's the pumping station. Obviously, they both existed today. The pumping station is still used. As you may know, they were built out of limestone. So when the Great Chicago Fire happened in 1871, they survived. I will also point out these two mansions right here. They were owned by the Farwell brothers, who will come up again later in the presentation. So Chicago, however, still had a grave problem. If you've ever been to beautiful Lincoln Park, you might have wondered, why in the world is there a mausoleum sitting down at the southern end of Lincoln Park? Oh, my friends, it wasn't originally Lincoln Park. Oh, no, it was Cemetery Park. So remember that whole thing about the water level? You couldn't dig 6 feet down to bury somebody properly. You would hit water by 3 feet, which meant literally they were burying people in puddles. At some point, somebody thought, here's a tainted body of somebody who died of cholera. We have water seeping by this body, and it's going to end up in the lake where we get our drinking water. Maybe this isn't such a great idea. So in 1859, they proactively opened up the Rose Hill and Graceland cemeteries, which are today on the north side of Chicago. Notice, they waited another 7 years before they actually stopped burying people next to the lakefront. And then in 1871, there was a little problem called the Great Chicago Fire. You see, if you had money, you had a stone tombstone. If you didn't have money, you had a little wooden marker. And when the flames went ripping through the cemetery park, it was nothing but a pile of ashes. So now the city of Chicago really had no idea who was buried where. Now, they will tell you that starting in 1872, they did manage to get up all the bodies and remove them. And we know that the government would never lie to us, right? Well, I will tell you that over the coming years, there will be construction projects in Lincoln Park or at the zoo, and somebody would be digging, and all of a sudden, thump, they would hit something solid, like a coffin. So anyways, today we have Lincoln Park and the Lincoln Park Zoo. That is where it came from. So as I mentioned, the sewage was flowing out to the cribs. And with that exploding population, it was more and more sewage every year. So instead of it being a water problem, it's a sewage problem. They eventually solved that. Between 1892 and 1900, it was an 8-year project, and it dug a 32-mile long canal so that the Chicago River no longer flowed into Lake Michigan. It would now flow out of Lake Michigan. It would connect with the Des Plaines River, and it would flow on down to the Mississippi River. Now, we know that in the United States, we have liberty and justice for all, right? So the city of Peoria, which is downstream, took this to the Illinois Supreme Court. Yeah, actually turned out to be might makes right, because the city of Chicago is a whole lot bigger than Peoria, and the city was not prohibited from doing this. So that was no longer our problem. It was Peoria's problem. Part 2, manufacturing. So the person who started it all was Cyrus McCormick, and actually his brothers as well. And his big invention was the mechanical reaper. So this is a very primitive version, one of the earliest versions of the mechanical reaper. And it might not look like much, but look what it replaced. And those are actually pretty fancy size. But before he invented the reaper, it didn't matter how, you could own as much land as you wanted and you could grow as much food as you wanted, but it would rot on the ground unless you were able to harvest it. So he would change the lives of farmers. So the chronology of his business timeline, he opened up, or he got a patent for the mechanical reaper in 1834. In 1845, he and his brothers built a reaper factory in Chicago. They were so successful that within 17 years, they'd begun to sell these machines to Europe. Needless to say, in 1871, the factory burned down, but it was rebuilt 2 years later. By 1884, he has 1,800 employees, and he's building 50,000 of these machines a year. The end story for his particular company is that J.P. Morgan will arrange a merger between the McCormick Harvester Company and other companies producing mechanical farm devices, and he will create International Harvester, which I believe then eventually becomes Navistar. So the business model that he used. So one thing to understand as I go through these various leaders in industry and manufacturing is that typically not only did they have a great product, but they had a great idea. They were really skilled at marketing, and they had new ideas that nobody had tried before. So the idea that you would give customers a written guarantee, oh, that was very new. He had a fixed price. There was no negotiating. On the other hand, he definitely operated on credit. So you could put down a deposit and then you could pay your balance after your first harvest. Well, how attractive would that be to a farmer? Because you don't have money before the harvest, you have money after the harvest, of course. He was a big believer in advertising. He also, similar to car dealerships, he had a network of sales agents, and they would have an inventory of reapers on hand. The reason is because farmers would typically wait until right before the harvest to decide whether or not they were going to buy a reaper and then which company's reaper they would buy. So if they decide to buy one from one of his rivals, they would have to place the order, and somebody would have to manufacture it, and somebody would have to ship it out to that location, by which time the harvest would have been over. He, however, had them sitting there ready to go. So that gave him a huge advantage over everybody else. He treated his customers with utmost respect. In all the years he was in business, never once did he sue a farmer for non-payment. And then the field test. So you've got to think about this. There's no TV, there's no internet, there's no entertainment out on the farm belt, right? So what would be more exciting than county by county, a field test? So everybody from all over would come to the county seat, and there'd be McCormick reaper there, and there'd be other companies with their reapers, and they'd put them all on the field and say, all right, ready, set, go. And inevitably, the McCormick reaper would win, and he would get all the sales. So Very effective, innovative strategies that he had. So here you go. This is the McCormick factory. It's absolutely massive. And you can see from this drawing the effects of transportation opportunities in Chicago. So at the top, you have boats that are in Lake Michigan. Immediately behind the factory, you have boats on the Chicago River. They could go into the lake or they could go down the Mississippi. And of course, you had things traveling by railroad. So all the raw materials were very easily transported to the factory, and then the finished product could easily go somewhere else. So what was his impact over the course of his lifetime? He sold 500,000 McCormick machines. Those in turn did the work of 5 million men. For the farmers, that allowed for the development of large-scale farms, a trend which would continue. But for those farm workers, that meant that 5 million of them were suddenly out of work. But it's also at the same time that cities are growing, people are establishing factories, and they need workers. So it leads to urbanization throughout the United States. We tend to believe that all the factory workers came as immigrants. Yes, a lot of them did, but a lot more people already live in the United States and they were working on farms. His impact was worldwide. And as you can see in the top photo, that is a McCormick Reaper in Algeria. And down below, you have a McCormick Reaper in Russia. So he was selling to all various, other than Antarctica, I believe he sold to every other continent that existed. So manufacturer number 2, so this is part 2 for George Pullman. It has nothing to do with the city streets at this time. So there were companies that were building railroad sleeping cars. Pullman got his own patent in 1863, but then through just random circumstance, he ended up getting a great opportunity, if you will. That's because President Lincoln was assassinated. And so Lincoln's body was put in one of the Pullman sleeping cars, and then it traveled starting in Washington, and it wound its way all through the Northeast until it ended up in Springfield, Illinois. Thousands of people, not just in cities, but people would stand on the tracks to watch the train go by. And what every one of them saw was the beautiful Pullman Palace sleeping car. So they really were something to behold. This is what one of them looked like on the interior, and they're really amazing. He had at one point 26 million customers a year riding on his in one of his cars. He had a virtual monopoly. He was producing over 1,000 cars annually, but then he branched off and was producing streetcars, trolleys, ships, and subway cars as well. So the way that it would work is you could see this wood paneling up here, that's an upper berth. The porter would take a key, he would unlock it, and that would drop down. And then you had an upper level of a bed, and then these chairs, the lounge chairs would fold down, and that would create a lower level. So this is what one of them would have looked like. So there's a woman, she's reading before bedtime. The lounge chair has been folded down. She's got a mattress, she's got a blanket, she's got sheets, and you see the same thing up above her. And then they have a little mesh bag where you would put your belongings. So if you wanted privacy in the locked door, you didn't get that. You did have the curtains at least. But you have to understand that everybody traveled by train at that time. And this was vastly superior to any other way of traveling on a train. So it was enormously successful. So with all these cars he was building and subway cars and all that, he was using a ton of steel. He tended to get his steel from the U.S. Steel South Works. At one time, that would employ up to 10,000 workers. Bethlehem Steel had 6,500 workers. Inland Steel, 25,000. U.S. Steel, 30,000. So those 4 steel manufacturers alone were employing about 70,000 people. But it's more than that. So you see here's the railroad train. It's full of coal. Well, that's putting coal miners to work all over the country. Then railroad workers who are loading the trains and transporting it to Chicago. Similarly, by boat would come all the iron ore coming from mines in Michigan and Minnesota. So you've got thousands of miners who now have jobs. So everything that was happening in Chicago becomes a major economic driver for the entire rest of the United States. So that's an actual photo of 1917, which is kind of the end of our era of the South Works in Chicago. And you can see the massive quantity of coal sitting there to fire the blast furnaces. So the workforce for Pullman, he had 20,000 people who traveled on the rails. That would include the Pullman porters, cooks, because the dining cars were also Pullman cars, and then the maids who would clean everything. So the Pullman porter, this is the typical uniform that they would wear, was basically like wearing a suit, very clear, clean cut, short hair. And the passengers that you see was typical. They were exclusively white. They were exclusively wealthy. And this man, even if he had $1 million in his pocket, there was no way he was ever going to travel in a Pullman palace car. So in addition to the people working on the rails, he had another 8,000 people working in his factory. So this one man alone, at least just in Chicago, is putting over 25,000 people to work. He created a company town. It wasn't actually in Chicago at the time. He created the town of Pullman, Illinois. And this is a picture of part of that residential community. Yes, this is where the factory workers live. And you're thinking, oh, it must be some kind of a garden. A little bit of both, actually. So he set out to create a utopian community for his workers. And it had features such as a library, a theater, a hotel, parks, a church, a market where all the people who lived there could do their shopping for their groceries and other things, schools, and the workers' homes. Now, the workers' homes were actually exceptionally nice for factory workers. They had plumbing and they had heat. And many other workers in factories, they didn't have either of those things. So he had established this town for 9,000 residents. That was how he saw his utopian company town. However, here is George Pullman III, who's going rapidly from hero to zero. So the workers didn't think it was a utopia. Pullman controlled all aspects of life in company town. It was a dictatorship. He would decide what newspapers could or could not be sold in his community. Workers were required to buy from company stores at rather inflated prices. And if you were caught buying from somewhere else, you would need to find a new job the next day. There were no unapproved meetings because you wouldn't want the workers to get together and talk about their dissatisfaction with conditions. Workers had no say in the community. Also, there was a great class divide. The executives also lived there, but they had much nicer homes than the regular factory workers did. So not only were the grocery prices excessive, but so were the utility rates. So he provided utilities, but they had to pay for it at the price that he set. So in 1894, there's a strike, a Pullman strike. What happened? Well, Pullman decided he was going to cut the wages of all his workers by 25%. However, he did not change the prices for the rents or utilities. And there would be tons of workers at the end of the week who would owe more to the company than they were receiving in their weekly pay. And so you literally have this great political cartoon here, and you see George M. Pullman literally squeezing every last penny that he can out of his workers. So the Pullman workers at the factory went on strike. And then the National Railroad Union also went on a sympathy strike. And what they said is, well, we're not really on strike. We just won't service any train that has a Pullman car attached to it. So all the trains west of Detroit came to a stop, which meant for many people in the United States, they could no longer get coal or mail service. The strike eventually involved 250,000 workers over 17 states. You probably know how the strike is going to turn out, right? President Cleveland said, no, 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 no. And he sent the army to restore mail service. There were riots in cities all across the nation. In the city of Chicago, he sent army soldiers from Fort Sheridan, and they crushed the strike in Chicago. Total 70 people being killed, $80 million in property damage. The government did generously, however, throw a bone to the workers. And that is 6 days later, Congress approved the holiday of Labor Day. Without the Pullman strike, we might not have that to this day. So in 1897, the family has a little problem. Turns out George Pullman passed away. And they knew that if he was buried in normal fashion, the people would come pouring out of their homes, they would go down to the graveyard, and he would literally rip the body to shreds. So they had a plan. First of all, they didn't tell anybody. They snuck the body out at sundown. so that nobody could see what was going on. And here's what they did to protect the body. So, of course, it was a mahogany coffin. Isn't that nice? But it was also lead-lined. And then in the hole that they dug out for the casket to be lowered, the base and then the walls were made out of 18 inches of reinforced concrete, meaning with steel reinforcing bar. So it's sitting there on top of 18 inches of concrete. Then they cover the coffin with a layer of asphalt. Then they pour a layer of concrete on top of that. Then they cover that with intersecting rails, steel rails at 90-degree angles, and then they top it off with yet one whole other layer of concrete. I will say that his body did, in fact, rest comfortably thereafter. And of course, you can go and see this today, but you would never know the backstory about that. So the effect of all these manufacturing facilities is absolutely stunning. This is taken 25 years after they built the canal in 1849, and Chicago's population of that 25 years had grown to 600,000 residents. There were over 3,500 manufacturing businesses employing 80,000 factory workers. They were producing in 1884 dollars, $5 million worth of products weekly. So multiply by 25. And today's workers, or today's dollars, are getting about $125 million worth of products every single week. So, and think about the McCormick Reaper. Well, if you live in the United States, turns out in 1884, you were the cheapest bread in the world. Of course, the United States also had the highest average wage, but that may have included the factory owners, because the factory owners certainly were not, factory workers were not getting a particularly high wage. But you can see how Chicago has been transformed. Part 3, meat. So in 1850, Cincinnati was the title town of the pork industry. It was referred to as Porkopolis. And that's because pigs could be shipped via the Mississippi and the Ohio rivers. However, it was only a wintertime activity. They had no way to keep the meat cold during the summer, spring, or fall months in the stockyard. So the meat would spoil. Even if they had managed to keep the stockyards cold, they had no way to transport it while it was cold to the various cities, which would be a market. So Cincinnati is operating maybe about 4 months a year. Within a decade, Chicago's come up with a totally different plan. Forget the canals and the rivers. You can ship your hogs to Chicago via train. Far more, far faster. In terms of the cooling, what did they do? Well, they harvested slabs of ice from frozen lakes in Wisconsin, Illinois, and Michigan, and they could store it. And yes, it would last. You could go to one of these storage places in the middle of August, and the ice would still be there doing just fine. So that allowed the slaughterhouses in Chicago to run all year long. In fact, in 1861, when the Union Army went off to fight in the Civil War, guess where they were getting their meat? They were getting pork from the city of Chicago. Jealous people in Cincinnati began referring to Chicago as that windy city. It has nothing to do with the wind speed. It never has. Nor does it have anything to do with angry people in New York. It literally goes back to Cincinnati. So 3 years later, in 1865, the Union stockyards opened. And doesn't it look glorious and pretty? But once you got past the main gate, it was pretty disgusting. So in 1865, here's the size of the pens. They would hold 21,000 cattle, 75,000 hogs, 22,000 sheep. They could have 125,000 animals sitting in the stockyards at any given time awaiting slaughter. This is a picture, and it's from 1947, but it hasn't changed much. Can you just get the scale that you're looking at here? And what you notice is every one of those pens is full of animals. So the numbers, unbelievable. The greatest number of hogs slaughtered or processed in any one day, 190,000. That's over a 24-hour period. That's not for a year. That's for one single day. On the killing, what they call the killing floors or the kill floors, those alone, combining the various slaughterhouses, they employ 50,000 workers. And that's not even counting the thousands of people who are outside taking care of the animals, getting them out of the pens and all that. was a horrible odor all over the south side of Chicago. You had 125,000 animals leaving themselves in their pens. And then you had the smokestacks belching out you don't even want to know. It was absolutely dreadful. In fact, it affected the history of sports, or as I call it, the stench of sports. So down on the south side, right next to the stockyards, you had Comiskey Park, which was home of the Chicago Cardinals. And some of you may say, what do you mean Chicago Cardinals? They're in Arizona. No, they were in Chicago, and then they moved to St. Louis, and then they moved to Arizona. And the Chicago White Sox, generally the stands were empty. On the other side of town, near the lake and with the ivy growing on the walls, you had a lovely home for, of course, the Chicago Bears and the Chicago Cubs. So because of the massive number of workers, the CTA created a specific L line that just went to the stockyards only, and there'd be different stops. There'd be like an Armour stop, and there'd be a Swift stop, and they were named for the various slaughterhouses. Oddly enough, it was the #1 tourist attraction in Chicago. The rest of the country, nobody had ever seen something like this. It was on an absolutely unimaginable level. People traveled from all over to come to the stockyards. Rudyard Kipling, who wrote the Jungle Book, he came all the way from England to see the Chicago stockyards. And then we come back to this guy. Henry Ford paid a visit to the stockyards. So our first meat packer, nope, it's not Armour. This guy was first. Gustavus Swift, the first big-time meat packer, and I mean really big. His big innovation was that he was the first one to develop a practical ice-cooled train car. That meant he could ship his pork products all over the country, and eventually they would even go to Europe. So in those openings up above, that's where they would put the slabs of ice, and as the train rolled along on the tracks, the air would blow over the ice, and then down below where the meat would be kept cool. So the stockyards were already cool, but then that allowed for the meat to be shipped. So they no longer needed to ship whole pigs to towns on the East Coast. When I say dressed meats, that means they were already pork cutlets. They were ready literally for sale. Swift, as I mentioned, then began to export meat to Europe. So that is what one of the original cars looked like. Here's what one of them looked like in 1899. He did not need the railroads to provide cars. He had his own line of refrigerated railroad cars. And it was only a matter of time before somebody thought, you know what? We could take one of those railroad cars and we could ship lettuce and carrots and celery. And to this day, the produce that you buy in the supermarket, it didn't come to this area by truck or by plane. It came on by railroad and a refrigerated railroad car. It leaves California, it arrives here about 3 days later. So Swift literally transformed how we get our food to this very day. So Armour was credited with this as well. However, Swift did come first. And Swift made sure they used every single portion of that animal that he could. Or as he said, I use everything but the squeal. So besides the meat, products that the animals could be turned into included soap, glue, fertilizer, medical products, and yes, before we had synthetic insulin, the first diabetics to get insulin shots, it was from pigs, absolutely. Margarine, buttons, toothbrushes, knife handles. Now this one we will acknowledge, this was an Armour innovation. So if you remember back when you were a kid, maybe your mom made you Jell-O. You know what you were really eating? Animal hooves. Yeah, that's exactly what gelatin is made out of. So in 1903, when Swift dies, here's what his company is doing. They are processing 2 million cattle a year, 4 million hogs, 2 million sheep, and they're employing 21,000 workers, and that's just one of these companies. 3 years later, the company was valued in back then dollars at $250 million. Today, that would be the equivalent of $9.25 billion. Then we move on to Philip Armour. So in 1863, Armour and his brothers, just like McCormick, it's assumed that there was only one. No, there was a family of Armours that arrived, and they established Armour and Company in 1863, 2 years before the stockyard opened. By 1900, they were up to 7,000 workers in Chicago, 50,000 workers nationwide. They were slaughtering 1.5 million animals annually. And although you can still buy Armour meat products today, the company actually, the family sold out over 100 years ago. So in 1920, the Armour family sold their controlling interest in the company. So welcome to the Armour meat plant. At the time, it was literally the largest factory in the world. And you might say, what do you mean factory? They're processing meat. Oh, it was a factory. It was totally an industrial system that was totally mechanized, and that's what made it work. Do you remember what I said about the smell and the smokestacks? Would you want to live across the street from that? No. Can you understand why nobody went to the Chicago White Sox games back then? No, it was disgusting. So this is a portion of his system. Notice that it's all mechanical. The animals travel by wire, by guided pulleys. You have in the top left corner, you have, and I know it's a little gross, but you have living pigs. Then they're picked up in the air. In stage 2, you have somebody who is slitting their throat. Then they're dropped in the water where they're washed. Then you have a slicer that cuts them open so that they can be skinned down below. And then literally, again, sorry, but this is what's happening. They disembowel them. They remove the heads. And as they go on each step, they get smaller. Now, this would continue on. They're not done. There's a lot more to be done than that. So what's really the impact of this? Well, in Henry Ford's autobiography, he talked about his visit to Chicago and specifically the Armour factory. So he was inspired by what he saw there. He saw workers who stayed in one place all day long while the product moved along. There were 125 workers on the line, and it went from a pig being killed to pork cutlets in 15 minutes. So do you see what this really is? This is an assembly line, except instead of the product getting bigger, it's getting smaller. So it's a disassembly line. But this is where Ford got the idea. Philip Armour is entitled to a certain amount of credit for the Model T assembly line, because in many ways it really stems from Armour's innovation. So inevitably, here we go, 1906, we discussed The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. Maybe you remember this again from high school. So here we go. It exposed the downside of the meatpacking industry. So for the workers, incredibly dangerous work, very low pay. But for the meat consuming public, what you would get routinely in your meat included blood, spit, urine, rats, and rat poison. This led shortly thereafter, literally the same year it's published, Theodore Roosevelt and the Progressives signed off the Pure Food and Drug Act, which paved the way for the creation of the FDA and food inspections. Wherever you bought your meat, it has been inspected. And the food that we eat and the food safety that we have in this nation today literally goes back to Upton Sinclair and, for that matter, the Chicago meatpacking industry. Part 4, merchants. So Chicago was at the center of the wholesale dry goods trade. Why? They had railroads going everywhere. They had boats that could ship things up and down the Great Lakes. There were 3 huge players, and they weren't just the 3 huge players in Chicago. They were the 3 huge players nationwide: Potter Palmer, J.B. Farwell, and Marshall Field. Potter Palmer, I'll break down into different pieces. By 1870, he was pretty much on his way out of this particular business, sort of. We'll get to that. So he wanted to focus on his real estate empire, including the Palmer House Hotel. If you've heard of it, yes, this was the original one. So this was built in 1870, which he advertised to all potential customers as the world's first fireproof hotel. I know why you're smiling. Here we go. Yeah, that's what it looked like a year later. There you go, the world's first fireproof hotel. How about that? Of course, his 2 competitors, J.D. Farwell and Marshall Field, did the same thing. This was Farwell's building, and that's what it looked that's what it looked after the fire destroyed it. But men who are motivated and driven like Marshall Field and J.B. Farwell were not about to let a little thing like the Great Chicago Fire slow them down at all. They were both back in business in 2 days. 2 days, 48 hours after the fire. In fact, this drawing shows J.B. Farwell's temporary headquarters. It may not look like much, but it opened 2 days after the fire. It was located 2 miles to the south of where the Great Chicago Fire had started. And if you wonder why they call it the Great Chicago Fire, that was to distinguish it from all the other fires. I mean, the whole city was built out of wood. What did you expect? So for Farwell, that was the second building he built in this 3-year span. The other one burnt down. This one burnt down less than a year from when he completed it. So in 1882, J.B. Farwell, he's back in business, and he builds an even bigger structure. So this really, to me, epitomizes the effect of Chicago and the transportation benefits for business. So you see here, there are wagons full of goods that are coming out of his warehouse. They could be loaded on the steamer, which would travel all over the Great Lakes to the cities on the Great Lakes, or the wagons could cross the river, and there were 3 different railroad stations where the goods could be loaded, and they would be taken all over. So that particular building that Farwell built in that year, in fact, it was the largest commercial building in the country. It had 8 different levels, and the footprint of the property was 280 feet wide. Remember, football field is 300 feet, but 400 feet deep. By that time, the company was back in the day dollars, taking in $20 million a year in annual sales. Modern equivalent would be $650 million annually, and it was employing 600 people. Next, we move on to Marshall Field's, but the Marshall Field's story might not unfold exactly the way that you would expect. So the business that Marshall Field would ultimately buy actually was started by Potter Palmer. Now, Marshall Field goes back to 1852. Marshall Field arrives in Chicago from Massachusetts at age 14. He's employed by J.B. Farwell as a stock boy, and he's so incredibly poor that he sleeps on the floor at night because he could not afford an apartment. Then things changed. His fortunes improved, obviously. And in 1867, Field and Leiter bought out Palmer. So I said that Palmer focused on his real estate business. He was very shrewd. He didn't abandon the ship. He sold in the business, but he retained ownership of the store. And he made him sign a long-term lease for an exorbitantly high amount of rent. So even though he was no longer a partner, he was still getting a lot of money coming from the business every year. So Fields really had 2 different operations. So the bulk of his business was actually the wholesale dry goods business. And he left that to the management of a man named John G. Shedd. I assume that a lot of you recognize that name. Marshall Field himself focused on the State Street retail store. It would eventually incorporate 7,300 acres of retail space, so it was the world's largest store. There were 12,000 Fields employees in Chicago, but it was actually so much bigger than that. So he owned different brand lines. One of those was Fieldcrest. You can actually buy Fieldcrest pillows and sheets to this day, and blankets. And men's suits would have the Fieldcrest name on the inner pocket. So he owned 29 mills across the United States that were producing all this stuff. So again, the city of Chicago acting as an economic driver for the rest of the country. So if you know Channel 7 TV, WLS radio, where did it get the call letters? World's largest store. And for that matter, WGN TV, Channel 9, where does it come from? It was owned by the Chicago Tribune, world's greatest newspaper. Not that the New York Times probably agreed with that assessment, but that's their problem, okay? So in 1930, Marshall Fields Corporation, he passed away, Marshall Fields Corporation built the Merchandise Mart, which was the largest commercial building in the world. It may still be. The Pentagon is bigger, but it's not really what we would call a commercial building. So moving on, part 5, mail order. And you probably all think we're going to start with who? Sears? No, actually we're starting with Montgomery Ward. He was first. His name was Aaron Montgomery Ward, and you probably thought there was a Montgomery and there was Ward, the same guy. And look at this. This is something that almost 100 years after his death, he was still rated by Forbes magazine as the 16th most influential businessman of all time. So as I mentioned before, these guys had tremendous innovations in their business practices. That's how they were so incredibly successful. So he was the original mail order magnate. So if you've ever seen the play or the movie, The Music Man, there's a song in there with a line that says, Montgomery Ward sent me a bathtub and a cross-cut saw. It wasn't Sears Roebuck. It was Montgomery Ward. That's not by accident. So his career timeline, as I told you, these guys are all connected to each other. He at one time worked for Potter Palmer, Marshall Field, and Levi Leiter. And in that capacity, he would travel on the road to rural areas around the United States. And what he saw was that people who lived there, they were dependent on the whims of the local retailers, which meant they paid absurdly high prices and the inventory was exceptionally limited because if you didn't like it, take your business elsewhere, there was no elsewhere. So he saw that. So in 1872, he founded Montgomery Ward and Company. The first catalog had 163 items, but they didn't really take off right away. It was only when he brought his brother-in-law, George Thorne, in, like a name some of you may recognize, the Thorne family, and became his partner. And that's when things really started to happen. So what was their business model? They would mail the catalog directly to rural customers. They didn't really need to worry about shipping. They would just put it on the train in Chicago, and when it got to the train station where it could have been Dubuque, Iowa, it was up to the buyer to figure out how to get it to their home. So what does that do? This goes back like 150 years ago. Direct sale, direct to the consumer. There's no middleman. So he could afford to pay for the cost of producing these catalogs and still keep his prices low enough that he had customers and he made a profit. Interesting, he had a fixed price. Unlike McCormick, he did not offer credit. He was 15 years ahead of Richard Sears. And in 1926, there's a total shift, and you'll see the same thing with Sears. They de-emphasized the catalog and they began to open brick and mortar stores all over the country. So this was one of his original headquarter buildings, looking very nice. In 1892, later, he literally doubles the size by adding this whole extension. That tower was at the time the tallest building in the city of Chicago. However, wait a few years. In 1908, this is what he built. This whole thing here on the Chicago River, that was Montgomery Ward. It was 1.25 million square feet. And in today's dollars, the company was doing 1.3 billion a year in sales, all from a guy who started with nothing. So then we move on to Sears, Roebuck and Company. And the two big players are Richard Sears and Julius Rosenwald. So in 1887, Joseph Sears moved his watch company to Chicago, and 2 years later, they founded Sears, Roebuck and Company. 4 years later, Roebuck leaves. So notice that this whole time it's Sears, Roebuck, and for most of it, there is no Roebuck. He's gone, but he just kept the name. Julius Rosenwald comes in, and he is pretty much running at least 51% of the operation. In 1897, Rosenwald said, okay, enough with the watches. How about if we add some other things to the catalog? Because, you know, you're not going to sell that many watches. In 1908, Sears retires and moves to Lake Bluff, and Rosenwald takes complete control over the company. Excuse me for a moment. I hope this goes off. That's not my computer. All right, here we go. So the business model was really simple. I just look at everything Montgomery Ward has done, and I do it too. That's exactly what it is. It was a blatant ripoff, absolutely. So the catalog would be mailed to rural America. In 1895, it had 532 pages. It must have weighed 10 pounds. But look what it had. Cars, homes. Yes, you could buy a home from the Sears catalog. Stoves, bicycle, drugs. Who needs a prescription? Just buy your drugs directly from Sears. Furniture, dry goods, and they were doing at the time $25 million in sales. 11 years later, Sears would have the first large U.S. Retail IPO, initial public offering, at a value of $1 billion. And they would build a brand new headquarters in Chicago. It would consist of 5 buildings, and the entire structure at 1.5 million square feet was in fact the world's largest building. So you see there's a certain common thread here, whereas J.B. Farwell at one point had the largest building in the world. Then you have Sears is the largest building in the world, and you've got Montgomery Ward and Marshall Field with the world's largest stores and so on. What do they have in common? They're all merchants in Chicago. So it was a really great business. So by 1907, they were doing the modern day equivalent of $1.2 billion, pretty much right on a par with Montgomery Ward. So this is the actual look of the cover of the Sears catalog in 1906. You would think it would say Sears. No, actually it says the Great Price Maker. It was kind of an odd thing. So the thing about the homes, I didn't make that up. There you go. There you go. Everybody go home and buy yourself a home from the Sears catalog. But the beautiful thing is after you paid for your $2,000, you know what they threw in for free? The building plans. Wouldn't that be kind of helpful to actually the plans for the home that you had bought? So here's the headquarters that they opened up in 1906. So understand this building starts somewhere over here. So we start over here and it goes on and it goes on and it goes on and it goes on and on and on and on. 20,000 employees. And this is with Sears where it all comes full circle. Because if you bought a Craftsman hammer in 1963, which by the way had a lifetime warranty, if you use it for 75 years, you could still go back and say, I want a new one, and they would give it to you. But it was made in Chicago. So here's what's different. The things that Sears sold were ordinarily built in the city of Chicago. So they're selling it, they're building it here, and this is where the whole thing starts to come together. So part 6, maintaining the legacies. Well, where it first begins in terms of the development of the city of Chicago is the creation of what's known as the Burnham Plan. So this over here is Navy Pier. You have the lakefront harbor. You have the parks on the lakefront. This would have been the center courthouse. That's how it was envisioned at the time, within the boulevards radiating out in spokes in all directions. So how do we get the Burnham Plan? Well, in 1907, he was hired by J.B. Farwell Jr. to prepare this plan for the city of Chicago. And this was you have to understand, Chicago grew just by happenstance. It was growing so fast, there was absolutely no planning whatsoever. And this was one of the first times that the city actually, I mean, in Washington, D.C., but this was one of the first times that a city said, you know what, let's develop a plan. So here they are. Here are the leaders of the Chicago Commerce Club planning for the Burnham Plan. This right over here, that is Daniel Burnham, who, if you didn't know it, he's the one who built the White City and the fairgrounds for the Columbian Exposition of 1893. Down at the end, we have Charles Wacker, as in Wacker Drive. Yes, that's Charles Wacker. This is J.B. Farwell Jr. This is his brother-in-law, another Farwell type. And over here, we have Marshall Field. So some of these same people we've been talking about, they're the ones that create the Burnham Plan. Not all of it was adopted, but when I show you this list, every one of these things is still in effect today. And what they did over 100 years ago totally transformed the way that we see our city today. So the lakefront parks, we have about 20 miles running from near the Evanston border down south of the Museum of Science and Industry. You have a ring of forest preserves that starts at the Wisconsin border. And locally we have Daniel Wright Woods and Ryerson Woods, and it continues on in a semicircle of the Indiana border. They double-decked Wacker Drive, which was wonderful. You have passenger cars up above, and all the delivery trucks run down below. A ring of highways. So we have the Edens, the Kennedy, the Dan Ryan, and then extending further west, you have Interstate 294. And west of that, you have Illinois 53 and Interstate 355 and the Michigan Avenue Shopping District. You may not realize this, but this time there was no North Michigan Avenue. It was called Pine Street. There was no bridge over the Chicago River. It just stopped there. And so around 1920, what they did, the city, in fact, built the bridge and they widened Pine Street and they renamed it Michigan Avenue. And that's how we get the magnificent miles today. It was all part of these men and the Burnham Plan. And then the landscape boulevard system. So those are the wider streets where they had big planters in the middle, adding a nicer little touch. So we've all heard about, I've told you about Chicago's dramatic growth, and you know the factories begin to leave. And then you see the reverse. Chicago's getting smaller and smaller, right? So one thing that's kind of interesting, if you stop looking at the estimates, these are actual hard numbers. Look what actually happens from 2010 to 2020. City's population actually grew by 50,000. And we know the factories are still leaving and all that. But what we have is we have an increase in, white collar jobs and service industry jobs. And over the past 30 years, downtown Chicago has grown faster than any other American city. In 1970, if you had walked through the Loop at 8 p.m., you wouldn't have seen anybody. It was dead. There was nothing there. But today, for younger people, you have the attractions, the foodies, you've got all the restaurants everywhere, you've got the Broadway theaters, you've got on the near south side, they had this huge college student campus. So there's so much going on for younger people that actually we see that it's growing. And a lot of those office buildings, those offices will never be leased again after COVID. And so what we see, Chicago and other cities are seeing the same thing. Those are being converted to apartments. So what were all offices are now becoming increasingly residential areas. So McCormick legacy. So Cyrus's son, Harold, married Edith Rockefeller, as in the daughter J.D. Rockefeller. Would that have been a society wedding? Mm-hmm. And they built the fabulous estate at Villa Turicum in Lake Forest, which actually is a terribly tragic story if you're familiar with it. Another McCormick relative, Colonel Robert McCormick, owned the Chicago Tribune, and he's the one who built the Tribune Tower on Michigan Avenue. George M. Pullman, who always supported education through various initiatives, including for his employees, in 1950, the family took the money that was still left and they created a new foundation called the George M. Pullman Educational Foundation. Since 1950, that foundation has given out $38 million in scholarships to over 11,000 students to attend over 750 colleges. Swift. Oh, sorry. All right. So what did Swift do? Swift gave the funding to launch what is known today as the Northwestern University School of Communications. He called it back in the day the School of Oratory. But so think about people like this: Julia Louise Dreyfus and her 11 Emmys, a graduate from that program. Charlton Heston, Academy Award winner, whether you call him Ben-Hur or whether you call him Moses. Either way, he's the guy. And then Seth Meyers, who was a Saturday Night Live cast member and then became a talk show host himself. Philip Armour himself donated the money to create this. This is the Illinois Institute of Technology, which is across the Dan Ryan Expressway from Comiskey Park. This is the home owned by J. Ogden Armour. It was known at the time as Melody Farm. Today it's better known as Lake Forest Academy. So that's where that building came from. So how many of you know Frank Sinatra? You know the song State Street, That Great Street? So how did State Street come to be? Well, at the time, the main Chicago commercial district was along the Chicago River, what we know today as Wacker Drive. The problem with that is it was very busy, it smelled horribly, and it was incredibly noisy. So he convinced the city to widen State Street, and then that would become the commercial district that we know today. So part of his legacy is also the actions of his wife. And his wife, Bertha Palmer, she obviously had a big bankroll, and she went on fabulous shopping trips in Europe. And she was at the time that the great impressionists were painting. So she's the one who brought this painting on the left, this Renoir, to Chicago. So if you've ever been to the Art Institute of Chicago, outside of the country of France, it may have the best collection of Impressionist works anywhere in the world. And if you look closely at the little signs on the side, you will see routinely estate of Bertha Palmer. She donated all those works to the Art Institute of Chicago. This one I love. So it's 1893. The world's coming to Chicago for the Columbian Exposition, and the bakers at the Palmer House Hotel decide that they need something truly spectacular as a dessert for all these visitors coming from overseas. And what do they invent? The brownie. Thank you, Potter Palmer. Yes, that's where we got the brownie from. Marshall Field's legacy. I know you were expecting the Field Museum, right? That's a little too obvious. Does anybody know what this is? This is the Rockefeller Chapel at the University of Chicago. Why the Rockefeller Chapel? Well, Rockefeller paid for all the buildings, but you can't put up a building until you own the land. Marshall Field donated all the land that the University of Chicago is actually built upon. Montgomery Ward. So from the very beginning, there was a law in Chicago which said that nobody could build along the lakefront. However, this is Chicago. And if somebody came up with enough money, the city was going to let them put up whatever they wanted. Montgomery Ward spent millions of his own money suing everybody. And even if you remember George Lucas, he didn't get to put up his museum here, did he? So that's what we have today, which you won't find any major city in the world that has a lakefront or an ocean front like this. This literally goes back, thank you, Montgomery Ward. And his brother-in-law, his partner, George Thorne, if you've been to the Art Institute of Chicago and you've seen the Thorne miniatures, that's his family. The legacy of Sears Roebuck. Maybe you were expecting the Sears Tower and the world's largest building. No, I decided to go in a different direction. So there's Julius Rosenwald. And if you see these girls here, what's on the front of the dress, it spells out his last name, Julius Rosenwald. So what this was about is that after 1876 and the end of Reconstruction, the reality is in many places in the South, African Americans were receiving literally no education whatsoever. It doesn't matter what the law was, that was the reality. And so a unique partnership formed. Booker T. Washington of the Tuskegee Institute reached out to Julius Rosenwald, the head of Sears, and they came up with a plan. Booker T. Washington would graduate 1,000 African-American women who would become teachers at all these schools, and he would build the schools. Together, they opened up over 5,000 what were called Rosenwald schools. By the year 1928, they had educated a full 1/3 of all the African-American kids in the South. It would be 600,000 in total. Oh, and by the way, he did establish the Museum of Science and Industry in 1933. Just a little something else. So you may have noticed that there was one person I skipped. That was the legacy of Farwell. And if you want to know the legacy of Farwell, and it's rather extensive, you need to come back. I'm going to rest for 12 days. You can rest for 12 days. But on July 28th, I will present to you the life and legacy of C.B. Farwell. So yes, he was Lake Forest founding father. So what I'm doing is I'm taking the same 75 years that you had today, which was all about the city of Chicago, but I'll be covering the 75 years for Lake Forest and the immediate area. So it's literally a parallel presentation covering the same time period anyways. So, by the way, some of the accomplishments, part of his legacy would include, he's responsible for what we know today as Lake Forest College, Fort Sheridan. He's the reason Chicago got the Columbian Exposition in 1893. And then this one of the most impactful elections, presidential elections in all American history was 1876. He was a U.S. Senator, and he literally played a very key role in literally flipping the entire outcome of the election. Oh, and along with his brother, he was co-owner of the largest ranch in U.S. history. So we can learn all about that. So it's not going to repeat everything that we had here today. It's, again, a parallel exhibit. So I'll share with you, here are the things we have coming up next. July 28th, I mentioned that. August 14th at 5 p.m., we will have the next event in the summer music series. We have blues and barbecue. Tasty to the ear, tasty to the palate. On August 15th, we have Lake Forest College guided tour, thanks to our friend George there. in the back. And on September 10th, we have the Columbian Exposition Transforming America. So I will tell you in 12 days how Firewall got this World's Fair for Chicago, but the lecture will then tell you why it was so impactful. It really changed tastes and styles of the American public to this day. So very impactful. So if you want to take your phone out, take a little picture, love to see you here for any of these things. And so